lower interest rates are basically an injection of steroids into the economy. President Trump has said he would ideally like interest rates to go down to 1% or perhaps even lower. That is a very bad proposition, economically speaking, because what happens when you lower interest rates like that? First of all, it is the Christmas season, and officially Christmastide extends from Christmas Eve through to the Eve of Epiphany, which is going to be January 5th. The feast day of Epiphany is January 6th. And this is a time, of course, of great joy and celebration, great charity. It's a time of family. It's a time also to think about those who are less fortunate and to try to extend our goodwill and our support for people both near to us and also those who are suffering, who may be within our communities and may be more remote from us even as well. It's a time for peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Now, it's also a time, of course, when many people get the wrong message about Christmas, and when, in fact, you will see a certain amount of commercialism, a certain amount of consumerism that also starts to creep into the holiday season. Whether it's a little child who's more eager to have presents than to think about the reason for the season, or indeed whether you're dealing with adults who are thinking about all of the stresses that are upon them during the Christmas season, whether it's buying presents for their friends and their family and their children, or whether it's simply the number of holiday parties they may be going to, any number of obligations that can make Christmas a very stressful time, and a time when people are often thinking about their finances as much as they're thinking about the birth of Jesus and the celebration that they should be having with their friends and family. It's a good time to think about the nature of some of these economic questions that are facing us right now, because in fact, President Trump is going to make an appointment of the Federal Reserve Chairman early on in the year 2026. In fact, it may even come before Epiphany on January 6th. One of the considerations that Trump is factoring into his decision here is that he wants a Federal Reserve Chairman who is going to lower interest rates. Now, the reason President Trump wants this is because lower interest rates are basically an injection of steroids into the economy. Lower interest rates mean that businesses and even individuals can take out loans at much lower rates of credit. They are then able to take out more extensive loans, larger loans than they otherwise could, which means they can then go out and spend more. And if they're businesses, they can invest more, they can start investing in new facilities, or you can have entrepreneurs investing in new endeavors of various kinds. And this all is a way to give the economy an extra jolt and a bit more momentum, and to spur growth by injecting easy money or easy credit into the economy. And that sounds like a good thing. I mean, this is something that President Trump is thinking of doing because the economy has been a little bit lax in certain regards, and there is a little bit of feeling of gloom among Americans right now. Some of them are feeling that we haven't quite gotten past the Bidenflation that we suffered in the 4 years before President Trump returned. There's also concern that we are in fact perhaps seeing a tough job market, especially for young people, and in general that in order to make up for these headwinds the economy is facing, we would have to have more growth in order to feel more confident and in order to assuage all of our concerns about these other issues. So growth is seen as being a solution to almost anything. And if you want quick growth, lowering interest rates may indeed be a way to do it. So while people are going out there and thinking about stocking up on Christmas presents, the prospect of lower interest rates might even be on their minds as they think about, the opportunities to, spend money and to take out loans coming in 2026. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and also share this podcast with your friends. And it's the holiday season. Share it with your family as well, and with anyone you think would benefit from learning about conservatism's deeper ideas and its broad tradition. Modern Age is a publication that was founded in 1957 by Russell Kirk, who was the author of The Conservative Mind, one of the books that really put the conservative intellectual movement on the map in America in the 1950s. And ever since 1957, Modern Age has appeared in print as a quarterly journal. We also have a wonderful website that was revamped just a year or so ago, and its URL is www.modernagejournal.com. Again, that's www.modernagejournal.com. And there you will find on every weekday when it's not the Christmas season, a new article either drawn from our archives or taken from the print magazine, or a original web article, original web piece. And so you can find a variety of wonderful content at modernagejournal.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, and indeed, please again hit that like button and follow this podcast wherever you can find excellent podcasts available. There are some dangers involved in lowering interest rates, and President Trump has said, he would ideally like interest rates to go down to 1% or perhaps even lower. That is a very bad proposition, economically speaking, because what happens when you lower interest rates like that? First of all, you start to have more reckless, taking on of loans, more reckless kinds of investment. Things that otherwise would be bad bets become much easier to place if those bets if it feels like you're getting free money and you can simply have an unlimited line of credit at the casino, so to speak, or at your bank, where you can take out money and then go and engage in all the various, forms of investment and spending that you might like to do. So it runs the risk of malinvestment if you have interest rates that are too low. It also, of course, tends to be inflationary. If you have very low interest rates and there's more money flowing into the economy because people are taking out loans and because they feel as if this is a moment for expenditure and development, that tends to have an inflationary effect upon basically everything. And that, of course, is the thing that Americans as consumers and also Americans as voters are most concerned about. So even now, just as inflation led to the defeat of the Democrats in 2024, when first with Biden and subsequently substituting him for having Kamala Harris substitute for him, that was a disaster for them, and it was based largely on Americans' concerns about inflation. President Trump, in an attempt to try to give the economy a bit of extra momentum, is risking creating more inflation if indeed he appoints a Federal Reserve chairman in early 2026 who's going to lower interest rates drastically. So that's one threat that we should be concerned about as we look at the economic environment the country is facing at the very end of 2025. Now, having said that, let me also go back to something that Donald Trump had brought up a few weeks earlier. He was giving a speech, and he made reference to an idea that he had brought up in the past, which is that, maybe Americans should actually not be spending quite as much. Maybe, in fact, if the effect of tariffs is to create less foreign goods being available for low prices in America, maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. And so President Trump, on a couple of occasions, and again at the end of 2025, ventured this idea that maybe Americans don't need to have, and he uses the image of dolls. So instead of having, parents buy $30 dolls rather, for their daughter, maybe just buy 3 dolls. And this was met with a tremendous amount of outrage on the part of some folks on the center-right, some libertarians, even some people who think of themselves as economic conservatives, because it seemed as if Trump was saying, hey, Americans can't have it all, Americans can't have plenty, instead they have to be, penny pinching, and they have to be rather less than optimistic as they look at the economic conditions, and instead they have to, impose discipline on themselves and be less, perhaps, spendthrift or even less generous than they would like to be. But of course, what President Trump was saying is actually something that is historically common sense among Americans, and in fact has very good pedigrees in, not just economic thought, but in political economy and in political thought, going back all the way to the ancient world, going back all the way to Aristotle. This idea that we can spend ourselves to happiness is, of course, a tremendous fallacy. It is completely false, and yet it's something that, unfortunately, some folks have internalized as a deep-seated belief, and something that they even get offended by, or they get offended if anyone doesn't pay due homage to that belief. They wind up saying that, well, if you're saying that people should tighten their belts and they should not go out and, feast so much and they should not go out and spend so much, well, that means that you're basically against joy and you're basically against happiness. You're basically against consumer satisfaction, and therefore you're a bad person because you're calling for austerity. Well, the Christmas season is certainly a time to celebrate, to have good meals with friends, and indeed to shower generosity among your friends and family, and to to celebrate not only Christmas Day itself as a feast, but there are a number of other feasts during the Christmastide season. That said, we should keep in mind that, simply being spendthrift and simply being willing to spend money which perhaps you can ill afford to lose is not a good idea. And that if you feel as if, you have to be a little constrained, that's not always a bad thing. That in fact, being able to live within your means is a good thing. And so when President Trump says that perhaps, Americans should be less consumerist, they should think less about having dozens of dollies, they should instead think in terms of perhaps focusing on a few that they might have and enjoy, or that their daughters might enjoy for Christmas, rather than having more necessarily being better. In the same way, when we think about interest rates and we think about what's coming in 2026, we should also realize that, in fact, lowering interest rates and having this flood of credit into the economy can wind up being very detrimental. What we actually need is a rather sober credit system. We need to actually keep up a certain amount of relatively high interest rates in order to compensate for the inflation that we suffered during the Biden years. And that's what's ultimately going to tame inflation and start to bring prices down. This, of course, was one of the famously successful things that Alan Greenspan did when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He had, and before him, it was Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker, who was actually appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve by Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, Volcker stayed on as Federal Reserve Chairman in the Reagan administration. Reagan actually valued Paul Volcker a great deal, and it's precisely because Volcker did, in fact, keep interest rates fairly high in order to crush the inflation that had gotten out of control in the 70s and that left Americans feeling, so unhappy and so pessimistic about their future that they wound up, in fact, throwing Jimmy Carter out of office. Now, Carter made plenty of mistakes on his own. He wasn't simply the fact that Americans were worried about inflation that causes Americans to vote Jimmy Carter out in 1980. But inflation was very much on their minds. It was one of their top concerns. Just as, once again, inflation was a top concern in 2024. And even now, as we go from 2024 towards the 2026 midterm elections, and then ultimately the 2028 presidential elections, inflation is something that Americans are very concerned about. So the Trump administration should pursue economic policies that are designed to stop inflation no matter what. That may even require that interest rates remain fairly high. That's going to have a certain amount of drag on the short-term economy. It means you're not going to have, a sort of burst of credit unleashed into the economy that could quickly boost things. But it's better to have slow and relatively steady, healthy growth rather than having this quick injection of steroids that suddenly appears to give the economy the semblance of health, but in fact is ultimately destructive and will ultimately tear it down. So this Christmas, I just wanted to emphasize that, it is a time of joy, but joy is not simply about material goods. Joy is fundamentally about God and man, and it's fundamentally about our human relations with our families, our friends, our communities, and having a charitable disposition towards all of our fellow created beings.